All right. Good evening. I'm John Diamond, the director of the Center for Public Finance. I'd like to thank all of you for being here tonight and supporting the Baker Institute and the Center for Public Finance. Without your support, events like this would not be possible. And tonight, I think we have a great event for you. So our book forum is sparse. We usually try to have 1 to 2 a year. And we really try to bring in really notable authors that have done important work. And so far, I think we've been successful at doing that. But that limits the number of people you bring in. I was excited when I found this book. It's an excellent book on a topic that is critical to the economy. And to read it, I'm going to have to put my glasses on. So this book is, I read through the back jacket cover, and the words that very accomplished economists used to describe the book were things like important, courageous, data-rich, well-written. I would add in timely. It addresses, whereas the book is titled The Two-Parent Privilege, and it's a book about marriage in some sense, it goes so far beyond just being about marriage. I would say the book covers the economic effects of changing marital patterns while also explaining why marital patterns have been changing over the years. Within all of that, you have children and others being affected. All of that to say, this is an extremely important book for the future of the country. And with us is the author who did a great job, Melissa Kearney. She's the Neil Moskowitz Professor of Economics at the University of Maryland. She's the director of the Aspen Economic Strategy Group, a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research, and a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institute. You're very busy. You're very busy, is what that says to me. But I am delighted that you're here. I really thank you for coming. And I think you're all in for a real treat. And if you haven't read the book, you need to pick it up and read it. It was fascinating and just extremely important. So with no further ado, Melissa, take over.
Okay, great. I'm going to keep an eye on the time. Okay, well, thanks so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here and talk about this book. And then I'm really looking forward to the conversation we'll have and your questions and comments. So the first thing I want to do is situate this book and the topics that really motivate me and explain how I came to this book. I'm actually not somebody who's been a marriage promoter or someone who's even really studied marriage over my career. But for 25 years, I've been studying income inequality, child poverty, social mobility, in particular threats to social mobility in this country. And as part of my work, I'm not just an academic economist at the University of Maryland, but as was said, I engage in a lot of think tank work and has been part of a lot of policy conversations. And what I kept finding in conversation after conversation and conference after conference is that our policy conversation around the topic of income inequality and social mobility really avoided what was becoming increasingly clear to me from the academic evidence, probably the most important thing and factor driving these issues in the US. And so in my experience in these policy conversations, we talked a lot about the need for a stronger government safety net for families in the US, something I've written a lot about and really believe we do need a stronger government safety net. We talk a lot about the need for improved schools. That's obviously an ongoing conversation that this country's been having for over 50 years. And then economists would also lean into the need for affordable housing, expanded access to affordable college, criminal justice reform. We would talk about ways to improve labor market institutions. We'd debate the minimum wage or the earned income tax credit. There's lots of ways economists would suggest making the tax code more progressive so there was more redistribution. But in every one of these conversations, whenever I'd say, and what do we do about the growing divide in family structure in the US and what's happening to kids who aren't growing up with two parents, it would really be met with a lot of uncomfortable silence. And I think a lot of that is well-meaning. People don't want to sound judgy. Nobody wants to, I think most of us anyway, don't want to go back to a time where single moms and their children were really stigmatized or outcast from society. And another reason why I think that this issue would sort of be met with silence in these kinds of conversations is because it's hard for us as economists or policy wonks or policy observers to know what to do about it. It's a lot easier for us to talk about how to reform the tax code or what to suggest that schools do than think about how to strengthen families. But I got to the point a couple of years ago that I felt like we really weren't going to have a productive conversation about how to close class gaps in this country if we didn't talk about the issue of families and make strengthening families a policy priority. So that's really what this book is about, and that's the reason I wrote it. So let me just start with the motivating fact, which is that there has been a seismic shift in the way kids in this country have been or are being raised over the past 40 years. So what I'm showing you in the top line here is that the share of US kids at a point in time in the US Census who live in a married parent home has fallen to 63%. I think most people don't realize that only 63% of kids in this country are growing up with married parents. That's not necessarily their biological parents, it's just married parents in their home. Most of that decrease occurred in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. My read of that line is that it's basically stabilized. I don't see any reason to think it's going up. Maybe it stopped going down, but 63% is a pretty low number, at least compared to where we've been historically. Importantly, it's not the case that what's happened in the US over the past 40 years is that people have just become, let's say, more European, and instead of getting married, live in long-term, cohabiting, stable relationships. That's actually quite rare in the US. In the US Census, only 8% of kids live with what we call cohabiting parents. What does that mean? It means one biological parent and that parent's partner. And actually, in about a quarter to 40% of those cases, that second partner is not the child's second biological parent. So even that sort of overstates how many kids are living with two unmarried parents. Rather, the most, after marriage, the most common living arrangement for kids is to be living with an unpartnered mother. So 21% of kids live with an unpartnered mother. Another 4.5% of kids live with an unpartnered father. So, a dad who has neither a married or unmarried partner in the home. And another 4.5% of kids live with neither parent. All right. American kids are more likely than kids in anywhere in the world among the 130 countries for which we have this data to live in a single parent home. So this is really quite a US phenomenon for this many kids to be living outside a two-parent home. The only country that's starting to catch up to us in a meaningful way is the UK. Now, by this methodology of the Pew Research Center, they have 21% of their kids are living in a single-parent home. In the European Union, the average is 13%. Around the world, in these 130 countries, it's 7%. So this is really, an unfortunate, in my view, distinction that American kids hold. One common, far too sanguine reaction to this is, well, American women are, so much more economically successful and independent that they can afford to do this by themselves more than other women in the country. But it's really important to realize that it is not the women in the US who are most economically successful who have moved away from two-parent homes. And so this really is a story now where raising kids in a married parent home is an advantage or a privilege of the early advantaged class in America. And by that, I mean the college-educated class. So what I'm showing you here is that this is the top line again, among kids whose moms in the census report having a 4-year college degree, the share of them living in a married parent home has fallen only 6 percentage points over this 40-year period, from 90% to 84%. And that small decline is quite remarkable because this group has become much larger, less selective, more varied. It used to be only 11% of moms had 4-year college degrees, now 30%. And yet still marriage is holding quite steady among that highly educated group. The least educated moms really saw a reduction in the share of their kids living in married parent homes in the 80s and 90s. You see that in the bottom line. So around the mid-90s, scholars started paying attention to this. We're really worried about the most disadvantaged moms, teen moms, single moms, moms without a high school degree. I think the very surprising story here is what's happened in the middle. The majority of moms in this country have a high school degree or some college. Let's refer to them as like the middle educated group or the middle class. Their shares of raising their kids in married parent homes has converged down. And so now the group that really stands apart are the college educated. And again, that's why I'm really leaning into this, idea and notion that this has now become a luxury good, an advantaged good, a privilege. And so anyone who cares about equity should really be worried that college educated moms are still highly likely to be raising their kids with the benefit of a spouse in the house. And outside that class, there's really been quite a move away from two-parent or married parent homes. If I look at the data instead in terms of cohabitation, the story is the same. So I'm just flipping, the way I'm looking at this here and showing you the share of kids who are living with an unpartnered mother by the mom's education status. And you see that it's 12% among kids whose moms have a 4-year college degree versus 29 and 30% among the other groups. What I'm showing you in these figures illustrates the fact that there's really both a class now and racial ethnic element to the issue of family structure. And so here I'm showing you first that there are level differences across the 4 major race and ethnic groups in the US. Okay, so you can't see this, but if you just look across these 4 major race and ethnic groups that I can easily identify in the US Census, the kids who are most likely in this country to be living with married parents are those whose moms identify as ethnically Asian in the census. 88% of those kids live in married parent homes, as compared to 77% of kids whose moms identify as white, 62% of kids whose moms identify as Hispanic, and only 38% of kids whose moms identify as Black. And so as long as there are those family differences, given the resource differences that implies, my view on this is that if we resign ourselves to accepting these differences across racial and ethnic groups, we will not close class gaps in kids' educational performances and their outcomes, et cetera. Okay, back to the story of educational divides. Within these race and ethnic groups, with the exception of Asian Americans, and I'll come back to that, over the past 40 years, we've seen this emergence of a college gap. So within kids, within the group whose moms identify as white in the census, you could see that kids whose moms have a 4-year college degree are much more likely to be living in married parent homes. Similarly for Hispanic moms, for children whose moms identify as Black, they're twice as likely to be living in a married parent home if the mom has a 4-year college degree, 60% versus close to 30%. The Asian American families, I think, actually are a really interesting exception that I didn't know about until I did this data work for the book. There, regardless of parents' education level, married parent households are really, an overwhelming share of those kids live in married parent households. I think there's probably interesting lessons to be drawn from that exception, basically, to the rules and patterns I'm going to show you. This is the same figure, but done in 1980. And here you can see that the Black-white gap in family structure had emerged. That gap emerged in the 60s and 70s, and it drew the attention of some notable scholars in those decades. But what has happened in the 40 years since, again, that I think has really been underappreciated and under-discussed, is the fact that taking these level differences over the next 40 years, again, with the exception of Asian Americans, every one of these 3 groups saw a reduction in the share of kids living in married parent homes outside the college educated class, such that now there's that college gap within these differences. Okay, on a mechanical level, this emergence of an education class divide in family structure has amplified household level inequality. And that's what I'm showing you in these panels. So bear with me as I run through this data, because I think this is a really important point that is just not widely understood or emphasized in our conversations about household level inequality. So here I'm using, again, a nationally representative data set, and I'm calculating household level earnings by the family structure and mother's education. So let's start with the top panel. What I'm showing you here is the growth in household earnings over this 40-year period by whether the mom has a 4-year college degree, high school or some college, or less than a high school degree. And what we see is that among households headed by a mom with a college degree, earnings went up by 59%. For the middle group, household earnings went up by 8%. And for the bottom groups, household earnings went down by 14%. This is the very familiar story you've all heard about with rising income inequality. College-educated workers did really well. Middle-educated workers saw sort of stagnant wages, maybe a little bit of earnings, and the bottom lost ground over the past 40 years. Because this is very typical of what labor economists would do. You sort of hold family structure constant and then say, let's just look at households, earnings. In the second panel, I'm showing you what happened to household earnings for households headed by unpartnered mothers. Those headed by college-educated mothers, household earnings went up by 60%. The middle group went up by 19%. The bottom group went up by 24%. Unpartnered mothers are working more and bringing in higher earnings than they did 40 years ago across income ranges, across education levels. This is well documented. Okay, we know this. We have lots of evidence in the economics and policy literature about policy changes, welfare reform, the earned income tax credit. Single moms are much more likely to work now than they used to. So this isn't a surprise. But also, let me point out something. Notice that even though all of those unpartnered mothers are doing better than they did 40 years ago, look at just the absolute levels of household earnings. They're about half that of married parent households. And this is, again, a really important point here. Median household income of married parent homes is about twice as high as one parent homes. This is why this is such an economic issue, and it's not like setting aside all of the culture wars and value-laden arguments people might have. It's just the case that now most moms work. And so if you have a household with married parents versus one with just a mom, a big part of the issue is that the single mom household, on average, tends to have about half as much income. We'll come back to that. In the bottom panel, what I do now is I allow family structure to move like it actually did in the real world. So now I'm just looking at household earnings among all families with children by mom's education level. Top group, college-educated moms, their household earnings went up by 55%. Basically the same as before. Why? Because they're only 6 percentage points less likely to have two parents in the household. The middle group, instead of an 8% increase or a 19% increase, their household earnings went down by 4%. Why? Because you combine stagnant earnings with a 23 percentage point increase in the likelihood that there's only one adult in that household, and you've just really increased the economic insecurity of the middle class. Right? So this is a big part of the story as to why the middle class is feeling so much economic insecurity. It's because they're so much more likely than they were in the recent past to only have one adult in the household who's bringing in earnings. And the same goes for the bottom group. Instead of a 14% reduction or a 24% increase, their household earnings went down by 20%. Because you look at a reduction in labor market earnings combined with a big increase in the likelihood that there's only one adult bringing in earnings. Okay, so the point here is that the divide in family structure has exacerbated the economic insecurity felt by the non-college educated adults, and it's widened household income inequality by more than the labor market changes would have done alone. Finally, in terms of what this is doing at sort of an aggregate level and why this is so important for us to address, the work coming out of what's now called the Opportunity Insights Lab out of Harvard, run by Raj Chetty and colleagues, they have access to millions of tax records. Like literally they can follow every kid born in like 1989 in the country and what happens as adults. In their first paper using this treasure trove of data, they mapped social mobility across the US at a neighborhood level. And then they reported on the characteristics of the neighborhood that were associated with higher levels of social mobility and upward mobility for kids born into disadvantaged situations. When I saw the main figure from their paper, it literally took my breath away because as an economist, what was so obvious was all of the things that we spend our energy talking about and writing about had very little correlation with rates of upward mobility. And the factors at a neighborhood level that were most predictive of upward mobility for disadvantaged kids in those neighborhoods were things that we didn't really know what to do about and we barely talked about. The share of households headed by married parents in a positive way, the share of households headed by single moms in a negative way, the share of adults who are high school dropouts, and the social capital index. When I first discussed this paper, when they released it in 2014 at a conference with them, I pointed to this, I was like, guys, these are things that are like we would, and I put it in quotes, air quotes, like these are things we would refer to as cultural and then not study. And this was part of like where, what drove me to the realization that we had to start thinking about these other factors as policy issues and not just continuing to talk about expanding college access, expanding the EITC. Okay, so that's the big picture motivation. Now let's get to why this all matters for kids. And my book really is written from the perspective of kids. Okay, the fundamental insight of my book, which, probably didn't need to study as much economics as I did to get this, but a household with 2 adults tends to have more resources than a household with 1. And that's basically my main proposition. And that's also why I am like a firm believer in the idea that we should be able to have this conversation without it getting mired in culture wars. It's, to my mind, it's like we talk about people with college education, they get higher earnings. So what do? How do we get more people through college? How do we help workers without a college degree? We should be having that same conversation. Households with 2 adults have more resources. How do we help more parents achieve that advantaged household structure? And then how do we help households who don't have that? That's the conversation we should be able to have. And so I really lean into the book at just sort of outlining how 2-parent households have more resources. We have lots of documentation of this, and we know it translates into better outcomes for kids. So that's a major theme of the book. All right, so how do we know that this matters for kids? We have dozens, I would submit hundreds of studies from a variety of social science disciplines that tries to look at kids' outcomes as a function of household structure, family structure. Now, the gold standard in social science is to run a randomized controlled trial where you randomly assign some group of people to experience some treatment or intervention and randomly assign others to not get that. We do not have an RCT randomly assigning kids to different family structures, okay? And so that makes it really hard to nail down that there's a causal effect of family structure. But what economists and others have done is tried to sort of mimic that randomized control trial where we run our statistical models and control for all the things we can, the mom's age at which she initiated childbearing, where she lives, her race. And what we see in study after study is that family structure it's a really high predictor of kids' outcomes. Okay? We see across studies that kids who grow up in married parent homes are less likely to have behavioral challenges as kids. They're more likely to do well on cognitive tests. They achieve higher levels of education. And then in the longer term, they achieve higher levels of income. They're less likely to be unmarried parents themselves. For boys, they're less likely to be engaged in the criminal justice system. This really is irrefutable. Okay? This is very, very clear in the data. So I think the more interesting question is, what is it about family structure or about a married parent household that's so helpful to kids? And about half of it, take that as a heuristic because it depends on which study and what time period and what outcome you're looking at, but just say a really sizable part of it is just the fact that married parent homes tend to have more income. Okay? That's not all of it though, but that's a big part of it. Now, skeptics who don't like this line of argument will say, so it's not family structure, it's income. If I could control for income in my regression, I make a lot of the effect go away. The issue is that in the real world, we don't control for income. In the real world, we have nothing like a policy that gives to families with only 1 parent median earnings for what the second parent would bring. In fact, right now we're having a debate in Congress about whether we can extend a child tax credit to give $2,000 more to those families, right? I'm all for that. But we're so far from a policy discussion where we'd be giving the median, single parent household an additional $55,000 a year. And so even if we could control for this in the regression, I think it's really important to just recognize that income differences will exist if there are 2-parent versus 1-parent households. And that's a big part of the reason why kids growing up in 2-parent or married parent homes are at an advantage. Okay, now, to be clear, a lot of the evidence on this was really about looking at, on average, how married parent versus single parent households differed. But of course, the resource context is going to differ. And so that's going to drive whether there is what I've called in my work a marriage premium for kids, or how large that marriage premium is. So here's the basic story. Again, I'm taking a really economic view of marriage here. So let's think about marriage as a long-term contract between two adults to pool their resources and share jointly in the consumption and production of household goods, and when there's kids, in the production of kids' human capital. Okay? Nothing like romantic or about love there. I know parents love their kids and just enjoy seeing them happy. But bear with me and let's consider the raising of kids sort of like a production function where you put in inputs, you put in income, you put in time, you put in emotional energy, and then you get out of that process children who graduate college, who go on to be successful adults. This isn't to say anything about like, of course we want our kids to be happy and well-adjusted and kind and all that, but let's just take an economic lens on this for a moment. So moms bring different levels of resources to this process. If we're thinking about a teen mom without a high school degree, it might be pretty hard for her to keep her child out of poverty or to get them into college. If her partner, the child's father, is also a teen who dropped out of high school, even maybe if they were together, it would be pretty hard to give that child like a resource-rich environment. Let's think about a mom who's older, she has an MBA, she has a really good job. She probably could keep the child out of poverty by herself. She could probably raise the kid in a household with sufficient resources, live in a good neighborhood, get the kid through high school. What about getting the kid through college? It's actually really hard to get a kid through college. It's not a majority of households who have a child who graduates with a 4-year degree. So that might be harder. Now let's think about the middle group where we know the decline has been the greatest. So you have a single mom, she graduated high school, maybe she makes $45,000 a year. She has a child with a guy, maybe he has an associate's degree, maybe a trade degree, maybe he makes about $50,000 a year. Whether they're together or not might make the difference in what kind of neighborhood they can live in, what kind of high school their kid can go to, whether the kid gets through high school or goes to college. And so I want to think about the sort of heterogeneity in the resource context. So my colleague and I wrote down this model and we took it to a nationally representative longitudinal data set. And it turned out that the data from the US really shows and illustrates exactly what you'd expect, that there's a difference in this marriage premium for kids, but it actually, maybe somewhat surprisingly, it exists across the age and education distribution of moms. So let me just show you two simple outcomes to make the point. What I'm showing you here is the share of kids by their mom's level of education and whether they've graduated high school by the age of 20. The sort of gray bars are the share of kids among moms who are unmarried. And that's what we have in the data set, okay? It's about marriage status. So to the extent that unmarried moms are living with a partner or getting help from relatives, all of that is baked in, okay? What we see in the data is whether the kid is living with married parents at the age of 14. And here I'm plotting the differences. What you can see here is the incremental increase in the likelihood that a child graduates from high school is actually smallest for the least educated and the most educated moms, right? So you could see the increments, it goes to 74% and 93%. The largest increase is for the middle group. So those groups are where the sort of additional resources brought into the household from the second parent make the most difference in whether the child graduates high school. And that's sort of what we'd predict from this varied framework, right? All right, now I'm going to show you the share of kids who graduate college, get a 4-year college degree by age 25, depending on the mom's level of education and whether she's married or not. So all the way to the left, what we see is children whose moms have less than a high school degree, 5% of them graduate from college, 4-year college degree, if their mom is unmarried, and only 7% if their mom is married. So basically, whether or not a mom is married, her kid really doesn't have a very high chance of graduating college if she has that level of education. But what's quite interesting is that as we move up the education distribution, the differences actually grow. For all levels, whether a child graduates college, that likelihood is doubled if there are married parents. In fact, the largest difference is for children whose moms have a college degree. Children whose moms have a college degree who are single when they are age 14, only 29% of them get a 4-year college degree versus 57% of those who are married. Because why? It's basically not until you have 2 married college-educated parents that a majority of kids get a college degree. And there's a lot to unpack here. But one of the things I want to highlight is marriage matters for kids' outcomes, regardless of or I should say across for all education groups. But also, it's not just about reducing poverty. So much of the literature and conversation around single parents in this households really focuses on poverty as an outcome. And it'll say, single moms in this country, kids who grow up with a single mom are 5 times more likely to grow up in poverty. Okay, like 30% versus 5 or 6%. We 100% should be doing more as a country to make sure that the share of kids growing up in poverty is lower. And so we need to be doing more to support single-parent households. But what I'm trying to draw attention to, the fact is that it's not just about fighting poverty. If we really want to close class gaps and equalize opportunities in a meaningful way, we want more kids to be able to go to college. And a stronger safety net is not going to come close to closing these gaps. Okay, by the way, in our academic paper, we do all sorts of fancy econometric stuff, which I'm not showing you here, but it doesn't change the main story. But if we could adjust for income, so if we equalize income between these groups, the difference between the married and unmarried share in this top bar only falls from 28% to 20%. Basically, what does that mean in plain English? Dads do more than just bring income into the household, okay? And so parents investing in their kids in ways beyond just spending money on them is actually really important to whether kids achieve these clear markers of educational and economic success. Okay, so in the book, I have a whole chapter where I run through the other ways beyond, that parents invest in their kids. And the main point of that discussion is to say households that have more resources, and having 2 parents means more resources, they spend more money on their kids and all sorts of enriching activities, educational activities. They spend more time with their kids. And there's lots of evidence and a lot of this evidence comes from outside economics, from development psychology, from sociology. They have more what I refer to as emotional bandwidth. And the idea is called different things in different literatures, but the basic idea is this. If you're the only parent who is responsible for paying the bills, making the meals, driving the kids around, it's hard to muster the patience to talk to your kid the way the parenting books tells us we're supposed to talk to our kids, or to sit down and patiently help your kids with homework. And so all I'm doing in this work is showing that, of course the data show us that single moms are more likely to be stressed. And what the data shows, in their own self-reports on nationally representative data sets, single moms say they are less likely to engage in nurturing parenting. They're less likely to read to their kids. Some sociologists have suggested it's because higher income or married parents have a different view of parenting. I don't see any widespread evidence to suggest that's the case. So I sort of dismiss that explanation. And the explanation that I put forward, which I think is pretty compelling across studies, is basically when you have more resources and there's a second parent there to help pick up the slack or take on some of the household tasks, it's easier to do all these things that parenting experts tell us to do. So none of this is to denigrate single moms. It really is to validate the experience that so many of them will tell you, I want to read to my kid. I know it'll help my kid when they get to high school. But when am I supposed to do that? I'm working 2 shifts. Okay? So I basically show all that in data on time use and what we know about emotional bandwidth and engaging in parenting. Okay. Additional considerations. Does a couple need to be married? In theory, no. In theory, if 2 parents, again, with my resource economic lens on this, if parents live together in a stable environment and pooled their resources and invested in their kids together over the course of the kid's childhood, there would be no difference. But in practice, that's not what we see. In practice, marriage is the institution that delivers 2 parents to a home for kids. Why that is, I can't say. There's lots of different theories. Is it because the legal institution makes it such that people are more likely to stay in that arrangement and work through things when things get hard? Is it making the ex-ante commitment sort of, is what people need to do to work through things when things get hard. I don't see any reason to think that college-educated people are just less likely to, get bored with each other or enjoy each other for a 40-year period, right? But you could tell a lot of other stories. But for all intents and purposes, as a practical matter, marriage is the institution that delivers two parents to kids in their household. So that's why marriage winds up playing such an important part of the story I'm telling. Second issue, do parents have to be biological? Once we start moving from just like the number of parents to the specific relationships, we're moving into the question of relationships. That's really not my focus. So I give, very scant attention to this in the book. I'm really focused on resources. But I, of course, acknowledge that there are lots of studies, in particular in sociology, that really try to parse out more of the nuance on this and how children do with different relationships of their parents and the differences between step parents or single-sex parents. In my sort of data work, I'm just counting the number of parents. So same-sex parents, in my data work are the same as two biological parents. Okay, what about harmful parents? This is really important. In the framework, the simple sort of heterogeneous marriage premium for kids framework I outlined, note that what the second parent would bring to the household is really important to this whole production process. If the second parent would bring harm or chaos, then of course there wouldn't be a benefit to kids for the parents being married or staying together. So there's nothing in my book or in anything I'm saying that should be misconstrued to suggest that people should stay in a violent or abusive situation. In fact, there are two recent papers from economics that make this point quite clearly. What both of these studies do, one is written using data from the country of Colombia, one is written using data from the state of Ohio. They both just happen to have a very similar idea, and what they look at is in situations where a child has a parent who's been criminally convicted of a particular crime, if that parent just happens to randomly get assigned to a judge who's more likely to put somebody who's convicted of that crime in prison, it actually looks like it's beneficial to the kid. In other words, if there's a parent convicted of a crime, when that parent is removed from the household, the child is more likely to do well in school, right? So I think it's a bit sad, but it makes the point quite clearly that average, just because this is benefits kids on average, it certainly doesn't mean that in every situation an individual child would be better if both of their parents were in the home. Okay, a final point I want to make that's really important is that boys are particularly disadvantaged from growing up in single-parent homes. We know this. We have really compelling evidence on this. In the book, I describe some of these studies in some detail. But over the past 3 decades, boys have been falling behind girls in all sorts of measurable ways. They're more likely to get in trouble in school. They're more likely to get suspended. They're more likely to get involved with the crime. But now even young adults, boys are less likely to go to college and finish. People have been noticing that boys in the US are struggling. And other people have pointed out this has happened at the same time that the share of kids growing up without a dad in their home has risen. And the differences across racial ethnic groups line up with differences in the share of kids growing up without a dad in their home. So I won't run you through these detailed studies now, but there are 2 really compelling economic studies that look at administrative data on mounds of kids, and what they show is the gender gap favoring girls is larger for kids who are coming from homes without dads in them. And then what some of these researchers do is go farther and try and say, what is it about those homes that are disadvantaging boys in particular? And really interestingly, what they show is boys who grow up with a single mom, as opposed to married parents, they receive less nurturing parenting. They're more likely to receive harsh parenting. They receive less parental time. But really interestingly, boys seem to be more responsive to that loss of parental investment than girls. So, here's how I think about that. I have a boy and 2 girls. If I ignore my son, or if I yell at my son, or if I'm harsh with my son, he's more likely to go to school and engage in what development psychologists would say externalizing behavior. He's going to bully someone. He's going to get a fight. Those are the kinds of things that might derail sort of his educational progress. If I treat my girls the same way, it doesn't mean they're not struggling, But we know from development psychology literature, girls are less likely to act out in just those ways that sort of get them in trouble in school and with the law. That's how I interpret these studies. But the thing is, this is really important. I'm about to talk about why this is happening, and I'm going to focus on the struggles of men. But I want to pause here and make the point, if we don't address the share of boys growing up without dads in their home, we're going to wind up in this terrible perpetuating downward spiral where fewer boys grow up to be the kinds of dads and reliable husbands that are sort of, driving the marriage decrease. And so helping boys is sort of critical to breaking this whole cycle that I'm calling attention to. Okay, the final thing, again, now I'm going to show you data from the neighborhood level from this Opportunity Insights lab. In a more recent study, what they've done is looked across neighborhoods, looked at kids who grow up in those neighborhoods, and tracked the differences in earnings between black and white kids growing up in the same neighborhood. And then they tell us which factors at the neighborhood level correlate with a larger or smaller racial gap in adult male outcomes. The factor that is most predictive of a smaller gap in how black and white boys do when they grow up, so the thing that's most helpful to black boys, is the share of households in that neighborhood with a black father present. This is beyond the benefit of having a dad in one's own house. Basically, having black dads in a neighborhood is a public good that helps black boys in that neighborhood. The second most helpful factor is the share of households that have white fathers present. Basically, having dads around, not just men, they show it's dads, is helpful to boys, even beyond the benefit of having a dad in their own house. Okay. So what's driving these trends? Few things. It is not a story of divorce. Divorce in the US is down. Conditional on people getting married, they are less likely to get divorced in the past, okay? In fact, if I just look at how unpartnered mothers wound up in that status, in 1980, 64% of them, of unpartnered mothers, were divorced as compared to 22% were never married. Now, a small majority of unpartnered mothers, 52%, have never been married. Okay, so that's the story here. This is not a story of divorce. This is true across education groups, and it's true across race ethnic groups, that you can see there's large differences. So 70% of black moms who are unmarried were never married. This is also really important from a resource perspective because kids whose parents were married at some point did have the benefit of two parents in their home for some of their childhood. And they're more than twice as likely to be getting child support payment from the non-resident parent, more likely to have engagement with the second parent. So we see this in the data. Kids whose parents were never married are the most disadvantaged as compared to married parents. Okay. Two, let's be clear, this is driven by a decline in marriage among adults without a four-year college degree. Again, this is why marriage winds up playing such an important part of the story in my book. Here I'm going back to 1960s. So let me just give you the sweeping narrative that I tell in the book. In the 60s and 70s, there were social, cultural changes we all know about. There was a change in gender norms, there was a change in expectations, a reduction in the institution of shotgun marriage. And basically what we see in these figures, is a reduction in marriage for all education groups over the 60s and 70s. Then we go into the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, and the decline in marriage stalls out among the college-educated class. But for everyone else, it straight lines down, okay? It continued to decline. And so this is really a story of the decline in marriage outside the college-educated class, the sustained decline in marriage outside the college-educated class. It's what's leading to this rise in the share of kids growing up with only one parent in their home. I'll show you. All right, there are various, what I just skipped through was showing you that this is true across different groups. All right, there are various explanations for this. I highlight four of the main ones. Okay, one is the marriageable male hypothesis. So this idea of a marriageable male was put forward by the prominent sociologist William Julius Wilson in the mid-1980s. And what he was writing about was the emergent family structure and marriage difference between black and white families at that time. And what he argued was that the reduction in marriage among Black adults and the rise in the share of Black children living with a single mom was reflective of differences in employment rates, higher unemployment among Black men in the city in particular. And of course, this, is a result of all sorts of structural factors: discrimination, harsh criminal justice sentencing, all sorts of things. And so he created a marriageable men pool index, which basically looked at the share of men in one's age group and race group who were employed, and argued that this was part of the difference. So now, 40 years later, I'm taking this idea to the education class differences and saying that college-educated men are perceived by women, or perceive themselves, to be more marriageable. They have not experienced the decline in employment and the decline in earnings that men outside the college-educated class have. And I'll show you there's compelling evidence in favor of this story. The second explanation is that women's relative economic position has improved. Basically, women can now be financially secure, and they don't have to rely on a guy who's not very marriageable, right? I am unambiguously in favor of that. So nothing that I say, again, suggests that, oh, darn it, if only women didn't become financially insecure, we wouldn't be in this problem, right? But what very careful research shows is that in places where women's relative economic position has improved, they are more likely to be unmarried. The way the author describes it in her study is women can be more choosy, right? Again, that's a good thing, but it's not without consequence when you have a decline in the marriageability of men. Okay, third, there's, Charles Murray has written about the role of cultural shifts, and there's certainly been a cultural movement away from this. I will ultimately conclude that the changing social norms is part of the story here. And then fourth, I'm going to dismiss this explanation pretty quickly. There's this perennial idea that welfare is too generous, and so it's making single motherhood too attractive in this country. So quick history here. In 1996, we had welfare reform. Cash welfare is now very hard to get, and it's very stingy. And beyond that, we have lots of studies showing that it is true that directionally more generous welfare leads to an increase in single motherhood, but the magnitude is very small. And so I conclude very strongly, based on evidence, that to suggest that the way to get out of this is to make the safety net even stingier for single mothers, and if we make their life even harder, more of them will have no choice but to get married, that would be a terrible mistake. Okay, so let me just show you descriptively that this story about the marriageable men sort of holds up in the data. This is just descriptive. But if I look at our 4 race ethnic groups across 3 education groups, the men for whom their earnings increased by the most, the college-educated men in all of these groups, their marriage rates decreased by the least, and vice versa. So just in terms of raw correlations, this story holds up. Men who have, gained the least ground or lost the most ground economically, they have experienced the largest declines in marriage. Here, what I'm showing you is that for the groups among whom women gain the most ground relatively, those groups are the ones that experience the largest decrease in marriage. So these are the high school educated groups. That's really where men took a hit and women did better. And so on top of the absolute differences, you've got these relative differences. But again, it's not that feminist success is at odds with marriage. So here what I'm showing you is that the groups of women who did the most well over this time period, the women with 4 years college of education, they are the ones who experienced the smallest declines in marriage. And women who did the least well, they experienced the largest declines in marriage. So it's not the case that it's women's economic success that is the problem. It's really that men have lost ground, both in terms of an absolute sense and relative to women. So we can hold 2 thoughts in our head at the same time. It's really good that women have made economic progress over the past 40 years. It's really bad that men have lost economic ground. Okay, that's basically the upshot. All right, there are causal studies documenting very clearly a causal link between factors like import competition from China, adoption of industrial robots, these things that have really sort of led to a loss of well-paying, middle-skilled jobs for men in those communities that experienced these shocks. That's where we saw large reductions in marriage and increase in the share of kids living in single-parent homes. And I talk about that causal evidence in some detail in the book. So, unfortunately, I have to conclude from my own research that turning things around is going to take more than just an improvement in the economic position of men. So for a long time, when I was asked, what do we have to do to turn things around, I would say, well, we really need to improve the economic position of men. And then in the early 2000s, we did have this one shock that was actually really good for the employment and earnings of non-college educated men, and it was localized fracking booms. So forget about North Dakota, where there were a whole bunch of migrants, but in counties throughout the country that made use of this new affordable or accessible technology to engage in fracking, what we see very clearly in the data is that there was an increase in jobs and an increase in earnings for men without a college degree. And my hypothesis was that we'd see a reverse marriageable men story. But when my colleague and I ran our regressions, what we found was in those communities, when you saw the increase in male earnings and incomes, you did see an increase in kids. Kids are normal goods. When you get more, when people get more income, some of what they do is spend that on having kids. But it increased in equal proportion for married and unmarried adults. And there was no increase in marriage and no reduction in the non-marital birth share. We looked back at what happened to the coal boom in the 1980s, very similar communities, very similar shock. And there, what we see in the data is that when that happened, there was an increase in marriage. There was an increase in marital births only, and there was a reduction in the non-marital birth share. I think this is suggestive of an interaction between prevailing social norms and how people respond to economic shocks. So you had very similar economic changes, 30 years apart. In the first period, non-marital childbearing was uncommon and it was frowned upon. And so people only had more kids if they were married. In the second period, in these communities, many of them, non-marital childbearing was very common. There had already been a sort of social decoupling of the institution of marriage from having and raising kids. And there, just more income to the men wasn't enough to turn things around. That suggests to me that turning things around is going to be even harder than just improving the economic situation of men, which would be, which is something I absolutely think we need to do, but it's going to be hard in and of itself. Okay. Finally, just to make sure we have all the facts straight, this is not driven by rising birth rates. Birth rates are down to everyone under the age of 30. Teen births are down over 70% from the mid-1990s. The rise in the share of kids growing up in single moms is not because there's an increase in births to the groups that have typically had high rates of single motherhood. To the contrary, it's happened despite that. Moms are more educated than they've used to be. They're older than they used to be. Anyone who studies this stuff, if we were looking at in the year 1990 and you said the share of moms who are teenagers is going to fall to 5%, the share of moms who have a 4-year college degree is going to rise to 34%. I think any one of us would have predicted that the share of kids being raised by a single mother would fall. But all things weren't held constant. In fact, there was a huge increase across all groups in whether they had their kids outside marriage. And among the largest group, moms with some high school degree, we went from 25% of them having births outside marriage in 1990 to 52%. Okay, huge increases. If you look, Hispanics also experienced a very large increase from 37% to 52%. Even among whites who have lower rates, 17% to 29%. The share of non-marital births among black women was already high, 66%. It's now 70%. So with these increasing trends, these swamped sort of the changing compositions of moms. Despite the fact that moms were older and more educated, many more of them were having their births outside marriage, and they would ultimately wind up being never married, unpartnered mothers. Okay, so just to recap the big sweeping narrative I just told you, there were social and cultural changes in the 60s and 70s. Those sort of prevailing norms were in place when we went into the 80s, 90s, 2000s, and there was a whole bunch of economic shocks that hit non-college educated men pretty hard. You combine those two, and what you get is a reduction in the value proposition of marriage for many population groups and communities, and such that now we're in this new paradigm where there's been this decoupling, and it's going to be pretty hard to turn it around. So what do I think we can and should do for the sake of kids? the most controversial and very normative position I take in the book is that I absolutely think we have to foster a norm of two-parent homes for kids for all the reasons that I just articulated. The counter view, which many people take, is, hey, the two-parent family marriage is a thing of the past, and let's move on and talk about how to help single mothers. But my point is, it's not a thing in the past for the college educated. We shouldn't be okay resigning ourselves to this very advantageous institution and family arrangement as now just a luxury good that only the most economically successful groups in our society get to enjoy and experience and benefit from. And so I absolutely reject the idea that we just have to accept this new reality. So what does that mean? It's hard to think about ways to foster a norm, but I talk in the book about social science evidence that role models matter, messaging from leaders and trusted adults matter. All of that stuff is generally outside the economic policy toolkit, but I think it's really important. I also, of course, as is clear, I think we need to improve the economic position of men without a college degree. I don't think we should bemoan the economic success that many groups of women have experienced. In terms of more, immediate things we can do, I think we need to scale up programs that have evidence of success, but it's really hard to find them. And my view on that is because we have not made strengthening families a policy priority. Think of how many education initiatives we've run, how many training programs we've run, how many healthcare initiatives we've run over the past 40 years. The federal government has funded very few strengthening families programs. And I think that's a mistake, and we need to turn things around, and we need to make this a policy and research priority so we can learn about the kinds of things that community groups can do to help more families achieve these healthy, stable, long-term relationships. So there's two parents investing in their kids. I'll stop there. I don't want to forget this.
Thank you so much.
I'll come over.
So I'm going to give you some time to ask questions, but I'm going to ask the first question. My head's about to explode with the number of questions I've written down, and I can't decide which one's the best one. So I'm going to make a comment to start, which you're not allowed to do. Let's not have big, long talks and then not ask a question. If you're going to give me a big, long talk, at least put a question at the end for our author, because it's hard to answer a non-question. So the dad thing, I was thinking when you were talking about the marriage, that you said the income. So you had these experiments where income went up in the fracking communities, but boys they still didn't marry. The young men still didn't marry. I wonder if that's a consequence of not having a dad in the home. And that's why it always shows up on how to make things better. Having dads in the neighborhood, even not even in the home, just living in a neighborhood. So that's a comment that you can talk about. But then, so I'm thinking about, we continually see in current news reports, and the president's upset because he's got this great economy, but yet everybody feels dismal and down and scared and fearful. And is it everything you're talking about here, that middle income and lower income families, they don't have the resources, they don't have the time to give their kids a chance to be successful in life? That's really the story you just told. And how can anyone be happy or feel good, even if the economy's booming, if at the end of the day you go home and you can't be successful in the one thing you want to happen?
I think people are just starting to take seriously this issue of like a time squeeze. Mm-hmm. I recently read something about why does it feel like Americans are struggling compared to Europeans, even when our median household income is so much higher, and people leaned into this story of time. So I think you're probably onto something there. I think this is why ultimately I really do, despite some silly things that have been written about me, I come at this from a place of empathy, right? This is really hard for the parents.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
It's really hard. I'm empathetic for the single parents, the 80% are single moms who are doing this by themselves, who don't have time to do anything, and for the non-resident dads. So when you read ethnographic discussions with the dads, and you talk to people who run responsible fatherhood programs, those dads all want to be good dads. Yeah. and they either don't have access to their kid because their mom won't let them. She has a new boyfriend, a new father of her new kids, or they have a lot of barriers that they're quite aware of. They they have mental health struggles, they have criminal records that make it hard to get employed. There's a lot of reasons to think that actually what these families need is actually more help across the board, and it's more help, to your point, than just, okay, wages are up for low-skilled workers. What's the problem? Well, you're still not really achieving the markers that a lot of us sort of associate with happy life, right?
Or here's $1,200 in a child tax credit, which
you can get that a check in a few months.
Yeah, that's gone.
That's great.
In no time.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So it's more than that. We know that the solution is more than that. You said that in your talk. So I want to open it up to everyone here. If you have a question, I would love to hear next. So we'll go up here and I'll come over here.
Yeah, thank you so much. I have so many questions. I will just ask one, but I have many more. If you would ask me what the decline in marriageable men was what was driving the decline in marriageable men, I would have said things like untreated mental health, addiction, things like that. Two things. One, I didn't see anything on the things we ought to be doing and addressing that. And two, I wondered how big of a role you think those issues actually play in the decline in that and the decline in marriage.
Yeah, no, this is a great question. So part of this is, I really came to this book like an economist, and so I'm using large-scale data sets with things we all know how to measure. And so I can see very clearly what happened to males' employment and earnings. I can't see what's happened to men's mental health in these data sets. So I have a very short conversation or discussion about this in the book just to make the point that I think all of this that we see, their decline in employment, the decline in earnings, is part of the same social malaise that folks like Deaton and Case have documented, increased opioid addiction. I don't know how to track all that and draw causal arrows as confidently as I did here. I will say, though, in talking, with a lot of these groups that that work with vulnerable populations, you hear this all the time. I went to a session with these responsible fatherhood programs, and they, all wanted to talk about untreated mental health issues, anxiety, depression. Again, many of them didn't grow up with dads. So this is one of the things I lean into in my policy recommendations. A lot of people will respond negatively to my suggestion. They're like, the government can't encourage marriage. You're like, no, but who wouldn't be in favor of programs to help dads or men or anybody get mental health treatment, right? And so that's when you look at the reports on why don't these healthy marriage initiatives or these strengthening families initiatives, there's been a few that the federal government has funded and paid for the evaluations. And what you see is ultimately at the end of the 12-week course on how to be a good dad, the dads know better how to play with kids, what's developmentally appropriate. There's some small increase in moms' reported mental health. It's helpful to them if they have a partner who's gone through this. But there's really no meaningful increase in the share of couples who stay together or fatherhood engagement. And so they've hired qualitative researchers to go in and talk to them. And it's a lot of times you see these real barriers that you're talking about. And so my view on this is we haven't gone big enough. The programs, if it's just limited to training and helping someone get a job, but don't treat these other things, or another big issue is intimate partner violence, who wouldn't be in favor of funding programs to address intimate partner violence? So I think you're right. It's just a lot harder to measure, which is why it doesn't show up as much in my book.
Very good question. We have a program here at the Baker Institute on brain health and brain skills, which would kind of fall under that.
I'm curious about the beneficial advantages of taking criminal fathers out of the home. Did you discriminate between drug crimes, white-collar crimes, violent crimes, sex crimes, and the families come closer together because they went to visit dad as a family in prison many miles away? What were some of the
Yeah, these were not my studies. These were two other studies by other groups of economists. And I can't recall off the top of my head if they found differences by the type of crime, which, as you say them out loud, you can imagine that would be the case. And I just can't remember if they find those differences. The reason I bring that up is just to make the point that, it's clear that certain parents, when they leave the house, it's better that they leave. I will say that I've talked to a couple folks who run programs for families with an incarcerated parent. Again, this is a place, there are millions of kids who have an incarcerated parent. Who wouldn't be in favor of funding these community programs that try to help those families? There is a lot of trauma around that, and it's really hard for families when the parent comes back. And so when you talk to the folks who work with those families too, what they try and do is run trauma-informed programs of let's help the returning parent integrate back into the family in a positive way. That's one struggle. And another struggle, of course, is when there is a parent removed, how do we keep that parent engaged in the child's life so they develop a healthy relationship? I think, ultimately we know very, very little because there's a few programs operating on shoestring budgets, and that's a place where I think we need to be investing more.
If I look at your bibliography, will I find some citations to?
Yes, you will.
Thank you.
And one of you mentioned in the book, one of the effects is the deterrent effect. So the kid just sees it, and there's this huge deterrent in the kid's life. Okay, I don't want to end up like that. Yeah, so she made the point.
No.
I just read the book. We're back here, and then we're coming down here.
Yeah, hi. Really interesting talk, and I think profound for the country.
Could you speak up, please?
A really interesting talk and profound for the country, in my opinion. There's one data that you didn't mention, and I was stunned to read that 50% of pregnancies are unplanned. And I'm wondering, has that changed over the decades that this change in partnership has occurred? Is it different in different countries? And how might that be playing into this? Because obviously, if it's an unplanned pregnancy, the family money goes down, emotional bandwidth goes down.
Yeah.
As you mentioned.
Okay, so let me preface this by saying I'm a bit heretical on this point among those of us who study fertility in the U.S., the economics of fertility. So there's a couple reasons why I don't sort of surface that issue more. And I have a brief discussion of it in the book, but it doesn't make it into my talk for the following reason. One, just in terms of what's driving these trends, it's not births, right? So births are way down among groups who have typically had high rates of single parenthood. So again, teen births are down by over 70%. Births to women in their young 20s are way down. And so, I've written about the issue of teen childbearing, unmarried childbearing, and basically my read of the evidence there is we've done a pretty good job expanding access to affordable contraception in this country. So Medicaid family planning was expanded in the 80s and 90s. And so, most women have access to affordable contraception. And my take on this is really where we see effects now driving down changes is when there's changes in people's motivation to avoid pregnancy. So I have a study, for instance, this is crazy, but when MTV ran their 16 and Pregnant and Teen Mom franchise, and it showed how hard it was to be a teen mom, you saw a sizable drop in teen childbearing. And you actually saw on the days that an episode aired, there would be a spike in Google searches for how to get birth control, right? And so it's not the case that unintended pregnancies are what's driving this. Okay, that's the first thing. The second thing is when you look at the data on who says we have the National Survey of Family Growth on who says their births are unplanned or unintended. What that really means is the woman wasn't trying to get pregnant, but it could be as much as I wanted to get pregnant in a month from now or 2 months from now. And then when you dig in further, half of these women who report their pregnancies as unintended, they weren't using any contraception. And only 2.5% of them say it's because it was too expensive. And so the way I've thought about this is it's more like people are ambivalent about getting pregnant, as opposed to it's really the majority of them unplanned. But again, there are plenty of people who would disagree with my take on that. I just think it's really important that women have access to reproductive health care so they can control their fertility. I just don't think that sort of rampant unintended pregnancies are what's driving this.
Okay. So to the best of my ability, I've got you're next, you're on deck, and you're in the dugout coming up.
Thanks for coming to Texas and Rice, and thank you for the talk. I really appreciate it. Can I ask, ex-US, you sort of identified us on that world map as a standout in a bad way. Stories from other countries of why their percentages are lower, either have stayed lower or have slid less than us.
Yeah.
First part, and second part, any ex-US success stories or sort of anecdotal governmental programs or non-governmental programs that have held the line on this stat.
Yeah.
We haven't.
Super interesting question. So the first thing to note is that in these European countries that have much more generous welfare safety nets, the share of kids growing up in single parent homes is much lower, right? So that's just like a piece of sort of correlational, suggestive, descriptive evidence that it's not because their safety nets are so meager. Their safety nets are super strong, and yet there's still very few or much lower rates of single parenthood. Having said that, non-marital childbearing and the share of kids growing up in one-parent home has been growing quite rapidly in other high-income countries over the past 20 years, and it's happened outside the college-educated class. And I think this is sneaking up on Europe in the sense that, like, before my book came out, I went and presented a bunch of this work to demographers and economists over in Europe. And they were like, I can't believe you're saying this. This is so anti-feminist. We would never say this over here. In fact, one woman said to me, and I won't call her out her country, but she said, I just did a whole report for my government on child poverty, and I didn't even cut the data by family structure. And I was like, you guys actually should see what's been going on in the US, because you're catching up to us, and it's not gonna be good for inequality or kids' well-being in your country. My best guess, again, put this in the bucket of it's just really hard to test this with data. My best guess is that cultural norms were stronger about two-parent families. So even if you look in Europe, cohabitation is much more common, but even those parents who don't get married, they cohabit for the length of their childhood. I've been getting tons of incoming calls from like journalists and other observers in the European context who are like, this is all new. Our kids are living in, going back and forth between their parents' house. No one seems to think it's a problem. It's like, oh, our kids did that in the 90s, and we're just starting to realize it's not great for kids, or at least saying it out loud. So I think in that sense, they have lessons to learn from us. I'll just note a related issue to all of this that I've been really interested in the past couple of years is the decline in U.S. fertility. We're now down to the typical woman has 1.6 kids in her lifetime, which is not enough for population to reproduce itself. Europe was ahead of us on that. They fell below fertility rates in the 90s. And so we can learn from them on that, and they should be taking lessons from us on this one.
Yeah, I think you touched on it a little bit in terms of sort of the importance of cohabitation, but kind of adjacent to that, I'm curious about the level of, 4-year educated sort of people staying together. That doesn't have anything to do with whether or not they're happy together. So I'm wondering if some part of it is just 4-year degree, they look around, they understand how money works, and they go, hey, we have a kid, this is a component. And so and then also you're mentioning the institution of marriage, and maybe that's the thing. And so I'm wondering if the policies are, geared towards, these are two people we're encouraging to cohabitate, maybe they're friends, maybe they're whatever, but in support of this individual, so there's a shared time and there's shared, responsibilities. Do you think that would have an effect, or is it really the romantic component because you're also teaching, this is what a relationship looks like, this is how you sort of like learn how to fight and get and repair, like what are those things? How does that work?
I will speculate and answer your question, but let me be clear that I don't engage in this speculation in the book because my threshold for including something in the book was really like, I'm going to point to evidence. But I think this is a super interesting question, and I have more questions than I do answers about it. I mean, why is it that college-educated parents are so committed to staying together, right? I I find it hard to think they're just more likely to stay in love. Now, the idea of like all the things it takes to make a marriage work, communication, that's a skill. Are they more likely to have that skill? Perhaps. We know they're more likely to have grown up with married parents, so they will have observed that. Some will even say that now the problem in America is not that people reject marriage, but they put marriage too much on a pedestal, sort of expect it to be perfect. If you grew up with married parents who disagreed and fought and stayed together anyway, you know that like you have a different view of marriage. It's also conceivable to me that it's more costly in a variety of ways to separate if you're high income, college educated. There's a recent paper by Kern Lowe and Jean Lafortune showing that basically if you have a collateralized asset of a house, that leads to longer marriages and more specialization in the marriage. If you don't have assets, it's sort of easier to walk away. I think, this is speculation, it's probably more socially difficult to separate if you're in a class of college educated people where your friends and peers are all married. So I think there's lots of reasons. One thing I will say on the policy, again, in part response to the bristling I often get about the government shouldn't be in the business of promoting marriage. How many high-income couples spend a fortune on couples therapy to keep their relationships together? Low-income couples can't afford that, and we certainly don't offer any public funding for that. But if we recognize how costly it is for kids that their parents split up, why shouldn't we, right? Why shouldn't that be something that other people also have access to?
I think the resource thing is good. And then maybe it's a little bit of like Becker complementarity. Their production function is to raise a functioning kid, and then they can go on dating apps once that's done.
You mentioned that we've made great progress in removing the stigma of the unwed mother, so to speak. I think a lot of that has to do with the mindset of the unmarried mother's father, where that used to be the crushing thing for a father, is to have his daughter not married. But the thing I'm wondering is, did you take any consideration into the impact of the media and entertainment industry in almost promoting unwed motherhood, starting with, I forget the
Murphy Brown?
well, even before that, Valerie Bertinelli was one of the
Okay.
daughters.
Oh, yeah.
One day at a time. Yeah.
Yeah. In the initial draft, I had a bit of more blame placed on the media. And now I point to evidence that we have, social science evidence, that we know media images matter. So I already mentioned the MTV study. There's another great study about what happened when soap operas were introduced in Brazil. And what Eliana Ferreira and her co-author show is that when these soap operas came on, what you saw is the villages that got access, there was an increase in divorce and smaller families. So it's not just that media portrays the way people are living, but people change their behaviors to reflect what they're seeing on TV. So we have evidence that media matters. What I have not done and haven't seen anyone done yet, but any of us who have kids who watch TV know this is true, in an effort to be inclusive of different family types, I think it is undoubtedly the case that TV shows and media more generally are too optimistic in their portrayal of non-traditional families. But I've not seen anybody quantify that, which is why I don't go into it further in the book. But I would love somebody to quantify that because I do think it matters.
We have so many questions and so little time. This is like a single parent household right here. Because we have all this stuff to do, we have no time to do it.
Wondering, you briefly mentioned just now too, what role does marriage counseling have to play in it? Do you think if somebody invested in those programs more and made those more available to these lower income households, would that sort of help the situation? Is there any role to play?
Yeah, so I think it's important to realize that the population of unmarried parents is a very large and diverse population. I can't quantify sort of where people fall, but there are clearly people who fall on the margin of, they're just sort of ambivalent about what they get married, whether they get married. The taxi driver in my book. There are some people, I mean, I encounter them all the time, like when I'm just talking to someone about my research, and they're like, well, but it doesn't really matter, right, if we're together. Like, I need to do me. I need to find my happiness. And I'm like, well, okay, but just so you know, actually what the data say, it's not that great. And so I think there's some people who genuinely, like, maybe if they knew how advantaged or disadvantaged their kid would be, they might be on the margin of making different decisions. We certainly know from some smaller surveys of these unmarried parents, like those who avail themselves of TANF-funded, healthy marriage initiatives. In the qualitative interviews with those couples, they say they want to be together, and they also say, like, they didn't grow up with married parents. It's not their community. They're looking for help. Again, these are small scale sort of ethnographic surveys. We know there's a group of people who sort of would like the help. How large that group is, I'm not sure. And then we also know, again, from some smaller experiments and surveys, that there are people who have real barriers. Intimate partner violence, severe mental health issues, that even if they want to be stable providers for their families, the barriers are very real. So there, it's probably going to take more than just marriage counseling. And maybe there, the best we can do is just promote some positive father engagement from non-resident fathers. So I think it's really, my view on this is it's really important to meet families where they are, and families are sort of in all different places.
Yeah, so I was curious with the kind of econometric idea of one of the major benefits being having more guardians towards a child, whether there are benefits towards multi-generational families, and on kind of a flip side, are greater amounts of siblings detrimental as well? That can you abstract some sort of like guardian to child ratio?
Yeah, this is a good question. So just as a point of fact, 67% of kids who grow up with a single mom have no other adult in the household. About 20% of them do have a grandma. Now, I don't want to assume that all 20% of those, the grandma's sort of providing a second parent figure as opposed to also, maybe being cared for. So grandmas do play some role in helping. They're primarily, when the single mom's getting help, it's often the grandma. I looked for studies, again, these aren't the kind of studies that economists run, but sociologists have looked into this. I couldn't find evidence showing that kids who grew up with single moms are more likely to have either a grandparent living with them or have frequent visits with extended family. So I think, I think what we know is extended families can be very beneficial, but they're not making up for the gaps, is sort of my read of what the data say on that. There's an older study from the 90s that shows for teen moms, again, this is descriptive, but for teen moms who live with their mother, that's more beneficial for the child than a teen mom who lives with the teen dad, right? So there are definitely instances where grandma is like maybe better for the kid as the second parent. I do want to say on this, sometimes I've gotten the reaction that it's like, oh, you're downplaying the role of grandparents. Grandparents are really helpful. I think we should think about this. We've got a whole bunch of women raising their kids by themselves, and then they grow up to help their daughters raise their grandkids. Are we really okay resigning ourselves to just basically writing off men and dads and assuming that women are basically going to spend their entire adulthood raising kids? I don't really think that's in the best interest for anybody. And it's been interesting how many emails I've gotten from grandparents who are helping out their daughters and sort of didn't plan to be spending their 70s raising teenagers, and they don't feel like they're getting the help they need. So I'm a little less sanguine about drawing on extended family than some others.
I'm gonna ask a question first, sorry. And then we're going to you. So I watched one of your conferences at the Aspen Economic Strategy Group on the pandemic learning losses, and the solution to the learning losses, if I remember correctly, was one-on-one tutoring.
Yeah.
Is there a way to get that in to help with the educational lagging of young boys?
Yeah, I mean, one of the easiest things to do is scale up mentoring programs. I mean, mentoring programs have been shown to be very effective at helping disadvantaged kids. And because a lot of them rely on volunteers, they're not expensive. In fact, one person who read my book, he was like, I run this mentoring program for kids in the city, in New York City. I didn't even realize that we were sort of addressing this challenge. Yeah. But we basically are, basically a bunch of men in finance trying to mentor young boys. Turns out all of whom don't have dads in their homes. So again, the more we can do to close the deficits, and part of it is just, for the boys in particular, just a male, giving them pep talks, advice, whatever, encouragement. I think that's just an obvious, quick thing. It won't solve the fundamental problem, but it can make a difference.
Have you studied at all the correlation between the decline in the church and the rise in the single mother?
Yeah, I'm embarrassed. This question has been asked of me in every single public forum. And it's not in my book, not deliberately. I just really came at this as an economist, so it just wasn't top of my mind. I can tell you that obviously there's a correlation over time. It's really hard to know which way the arrows run in terms of what we know is that over the same time that religiosity has declined in the US, the two-parent household has declined, fertility has declined, opioid use has risen, social malaise has risen. Do I suspect that all of these things are sort of amplifying each other? Yes. Can I find a study that sort of shows me when there's some exogenous reason why religion went down or religion went up? We saw a change in family structure. I can't. But on this point, we do have evidence that sort of trusted leaders, and here you can even say local religious leaders up to the Pope, their messaging affects behavior. People have shown that, very specifically in a causal sense. So when it comes to part of the solution, I do think, religious trusted leaders sort of having a message around this is probably part of what it will take to change social norms. But anecdotally, I can also tell you that pastors in some of the communities that have sort of the highest rates of single motherhood, they will say that they can't touch this issue for fear of alienating their congregants.
Okay, so we're going to go 2 more questions. We're going to keep everything very short.
Okay.
We're at our limit, and we're going to go back and then right up here. Go ahead.
You actually touched on my answer.
I'm not sure this is a good question.
Hold on. You're next. Sorry.
I'm wondering if you've seen any good examples of people either taking a middle ground approach. Obviously, this is a very political issue that both sides could use to their advantage in order to bash each other over the head. I'm wondering if you found that there are people on the left and the right, they appear to be approaching the issue from different ways, but I actually hear a very similar message coming out. I don't know if you agree with that. And is that the better way to go, is to let people on the left do their approach, but essentially have the same message, and people on the right, is that the way we should be approaching this, or should we try and find some middle ground, some speaker who can unite everybody together in order to foster this message?
So I very deliberately in the book don't say, oh, this is what conservatives say and they're right or wrong about this, and this is what liberals say and they're right or wrong about this, because to my mind, this should be something that gets support across the political spectrum, right? It's pretty easy to view this through an equity lens or an inequality lens or a need for more social support lens that progressives tend to favor. It's also very clear that social conservatives have gotten this right by saying that this is a problem for society. So we could throw everyone a bone. And now let's all agree. What people ultimately have to do, though, is be willing to say a 2-parent family is beneficial for kids. In my sort of read of the political tea leaves, which is not my expertise, that has become harder for some progressive groups to do. So, President Obama gave a beautiful speech about absent fathers on Father's Day in 2008. And then he never mentioned the topic again. My guess is it's his political advisors told him not to. And Biden hasn't, to the best of my knowledge, made any speeches on this. There's no reason why they can't, and there's no reason why they can't do it using the language of progressives.
And this is also very important for solving budget deficits, so forth. Last question, we're going to be very quick because we all want to get home. I'm sorry that we've run over.
That's all right.
Go ahead, we'll give you the last one. You're good?
You've answered it.
Oh, okay, well, very well.
Thank
Melissa,
you.
thank you. What an excellent book. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. Have a great night.